This is Word on the Streets, a podcast about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project. This podcast is created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 8 of Word on the Streets, a podcast about information, updates, and perspective on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project in Midland, Michigan. I'm your host, Katie Geyer, here again with my co-host, Grant Merschel. I want to point out for all of you that are watching us on video right now that our studio setup today looks a little different. There's actually a super exciting reason why. For those of you that aren't familiar, back in May of 2020, Midland experienced a significant flooding event as a result of some upstream dam failures, which resulted in the damage to the lower level of our library, which is where we typically record all of our podcasts, record all of our videos. So we were temporarily relocated to the library auditorium upstairs. But a year and a half later, we are actually filming our first production really of any kind, and especially our first episode of this podcast now back in our home studio, fully equipped and ready to go. So this is a pretty exciting day for us.
It is very exciting, Katie. Yeah, glad you made that mention, because being down here and walking down here and seeing a lot of the new fixtures and the renovations that's taken place is it's a very exciting time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have got a really exciting episode today too. So it's kind of perfect that we are in a new space and we are rejuvenated and ready to go.
That's correct. I'm also very excited about it, and I think it speaks really to the heart of what we've been talking about in this entire podcast series.
Yep, I think so. I'm super excited too. We talk a lot about the ways that municipalities and civil engineers are approaching road design nowadays. That's really been our focus this whole time, and how that's different the ways of the past. Now, I know in my case, I am not an expert on any of those things by any means, but today we are talking to an actual expert who does this kind of stuff every single day, and he uses the knowledge that he has to contribute to road projects all over the state. So it's my pleasure to welcome John Martin, who is the M2D2 CS and CSS Coordinator for the Michigan Department of Transportation, to our podcast today. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and congratulations on your on being back in your studio. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that too. So before we get into all the questions that I have for you, that I've written down a very large list, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about exactly what you do at MDOT?
Sure. I'm your CS or CSS, which is Context Sensitive Solutions, or CS, which is Complete Streets, and your Multimodal Design Delivery Coordinator, which is AKA M2D2, for the Michigan Department of Transportation. And I come to this with a background in landscape architecture and urban planning, as well as I'm a licensed builder, licensed building inspector, and a licensed plan reviewer through the state of Michigan. And my job is to take context-sensitive solutions in M2D2 and integrate that into our design process so that we can get the best product for our end user, which is inevitably our customer.
Wow, that's a lot of experience in ultimately building and designing a lot of different things. That's pretty cool.
That's correct. No, and I think just being in a lot of that arena myself with the planning department and the building department for the City of Midland, it's all very much connected. So that type of a background probably suits you quite well, John, for doing well in this particular role. As Katie said, the topic of context-sensitive solutions and design is something that speaks right to the heart of this podcast, and especially to something that the work that not only the planning department at the city has been involved in, but a lot of the work that the City Planning Commission has started to discuss more and more, and even things that we've talked about in this podcast previously. But for our listeners who may still not be familiar with this approach, John, can you explain a little bit more about, in detail, what content-sensitive solutions is?
Sure. The key phrase or the key word there is actually context. And in projects today, the focus in design is being specific to areas. In other words, the needs of community in downtown Midland will not be the same as, say, Imlay City or Iron Mountain. And although a two-lane road may seem like a two-lane road, a rural use of that road and the urban use of that road is quite different. And as an example, think of M22 and all the experiences that route has to offer as you move down that road. CSS and its application recognizes the differences from one area to another. And the stakeholders here again in one region would be different than the stakeholders in another region. And to reach out to those, the process utilizes an interdisciplinary team. It could be, our planners, our engineers, our landscape architects, pulling together the resources to pull out just about everything you can think about in that project. The key to it is multimodal approach. And, there are other ways to get around now, and that's changed from, the 50s and 60s and what we're experiencing now. The other thing about CSS is it respects the environment and the social context of the transportation network. There's different ways of how all this stuff comes together, and CSS provides a framework for that analysis to happen. And more importantly, it provides a safe and efficient transportation system in the end for all legal users of that environment. So it's a very exciting time that we're in right now to be able to implement to a further degree CSS and M2D2.
I love that you mentioned that context is so important and giving some examples of the different roadways and how that roadway might look a lot of different ways as we go across it. Buttles is a perfect example. You have it M20 coming into Midland, so it's a 2-lane highway, 4-lane highway, and then it's business route 10 once you go out, so it sees a lot of truck traffic. So I think for a lot of our residents, it was very difficult for them to say, why would we take a lane away from a business route or from a highway? Whereas if you look at where Buttles is located and things that are around it, it doesn't seem like it should operate like a highway. So I like that you mentioned that, because it's okay for those different contexts, if you will, to change as you go through different areas of the community and use that road in different places.
Absolutely. And as you move along those corridors, as in Midlands, where your commercial area is and your residential area, that's going to be different from another area.
Sure.
And here again, with Indian and Buttles, they have 2 one-way corridors, which here again is different than what you may see in another community.
Sure, absolutely. So now we've kind of talked about what context-sensitive design and context-sensitive solutions are, kind of reminded some of our listeners that may already know a little bit about it, and covered what you do. I want to know what this looks like in practice when you're actually doing this, and kind of what your role is in these projects as you come up. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the process looks like for identifying and implementing CSS into the different projects you work on?
Sure. A lot of that, keep in mind, is that the framework of MDOT's setup is divided into regions. And one of the main reasons for those regions is so that the project managers and regional engineers have the ability to get into their specific areas, as opposed to being designed from central office, so to speak. They're able to really have a good idea of what their project and subject matter is. My position is actually as a more of a support role to ensure that they have the tools that they need to be able to do what they do. And it's actually a really good question, because this is also why my job evolves every day. MDOT is committed to developing projects for community needs with environmental respect, and for the end user. And MDOT recognizes that this environment is dynamic. It changes. History tells us that to be true, even along your corridor. Mm-hmm. The CSS approach, and in turn M2D2, provides a framework for activity and engagement. And here again, how we get in touch with those stakeholders and keep them involved in the project is very, very important to MDOT in how we do business. The inclusion of these vested parties, both in data collection and design, allows for the maximum benefit in a project. Alone, the parties may not be able to meet all their objectives. However, together, there's a benefit of scale, mobilization opportunity for everyone in that specific community to now be able to meet their needs. But it is definitely a teamwork approach, and it is our objective to ensure that the tools are there for our project managers and our regional engineers to be able to do their job.
No, thank you. That's so important. And like I said earlier, we're not experts for sure when it comes to this stuff, but the city does have a few resources as well on context-sensitive solutions and non-motorized transportation, and how we applied that to the redesign of Buttles Street that we're looking forward to. So if you are a listener and you want to take a look at some of those we created during the 2019 lane reduction trial, you can find them on the podcast website at cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors.
So Katie and John, speaking of Buttles, let's talk a little bit more about this project specifically, if we could pivot a little bit more in that direction. And we know that this corridor was initially designed to see traffic volumes and usage patterns that it's simply just not experienced anymore. So at the time when it was created in the 1960s, the context was very different. There was shift change at the manufacturing facilities here in the city, and what allowed the thought process to get to the 3-lane road simply just doesn't make sense for today's current context.
Sure.
And the designs that we currently, or rather demands that we currently have.
Yeah.
So when you're right-sizing a street like Buttles Street, John, are there specific considerations you're looking at in how to proceed?
Yes, Grant, there is. And I think here again, context is key in where we're at now. In the 50s and 60s, the mobility focus was automobiles from point A to point B. This is also a time when you begin to see downtowns begin to take a decline in the rise of destination shopping, for example, the shopping mall. This was a culture of the time. The demands on infrastructure today is different than it was 40 and 50 years ago. Our modes of transportation have also shifted. In the last 24 months alone, we've seen a massive shift just in the way, as a state community, we do business. As such, MDOT's efforts are to encompass these shifts and the needs of projects as they come up and to be addressed. For example, we see an increase in bike and pedestrian use, whereas 50 years ago, we would be looking at a street parking versus, whereas now we're looking at bike and pedestrian experiences along those same corridors. With an increase in pedestrian and other transportation modes also comes the consideration for other, for the safety and the feeling of well-being for other modes of transportation. What are the environmental resources that can be incorporated into a cohesive design that moves the community forward? These are all new things that face us every day as designers and engineers to kind of move these projects forward. In this case, a lane diet is one method to begin to address other mobile needs in the community based on today and tomorrow's needs. This particular method is just one, but is a great way to bring other users to your downtown in modes that are becoming more common. For example, you now have a downtown e-bike system, is my understanding, and that was not available even 5 years ago. So here again, it's a new change in how people get around, and these are new characteristics that become part of the design process.
Yes, the bird scooters have been extremely popular. We actually just ended our first year with them, and overwhelmingly very embraced by the community, and just being able to offer another, we call it more like last mile mode of transportation, but even just something to allow people something else to do besides get in their car and drive. Not only is it great for the environment, but it's great for their well-being too. I mean, have you ever seen a mad person on a scooter? Never. Like, you are just happy if you're on a scooter. It's fun.
It's true. It's hard not to smile when you're riding them. And no, very good points. I mean, downtown has certainly evolved and changed, and the uses that surrounded Indian and Buttles, for example, are very different today than they were 15 years ago, and certainly different than they were 50, 60 years ago. So that context has evolved, and it's refreshing to hear from MDOT's perspective that it's important that we evolve along with it, transportation-wise. And along those lines, I guess, you mentioned sort of the considerations that were given to something like Buttles, and this being an existing street, obviously there's a lot of complexity that goes along with sort of retrofitting something that's existing, but are there different considerations for redesigning an existing street versus building a brand new roadway when it comes to CSS?
This is a great question. There is. And it's really actually probably more common than you think. The difference of new versus redevelopment is simply an effort in different areas. The design considerations on a new project are just as in depth as far as stakeholder input, design, and engineering. An example of this would be the design and development of, say, a new rest area or road. For this type of effort, in some cases, real estate needs to be acquired, if not already in place, or not in the right of way. New infrastructure would need to be brought to the facility. Water needs a place to go. Maintenance needs to be accounted for. And in this example, putting the shovel in the ground is actually the easier component to the project. Right. You take that into account of, say, a situation such as yours in a redevelopment in an existing right-of-way where you may have a little bit more constraint, but you think about it as kind of a remodeling of your home, so to speak. There are definite benefits to doing that. Infrastructure is in place. For the most part, ownership is also defined. However, as we mentioned, the working area can be constrained. You're working in an existing right-of-way many times. And so there's a degree of unknown there. And when you do put a shovel in the ground, that's when, things go, holy me, it really doesn't look that much like, like what we thought it was. But it's a tough balancing act. And I think if you talk to our engineers and project managers, they're going to tell you the exact same thing. But I think overall, you're going to find that redevelopment is a better way. Mm-hmm. And, the reuse of that space, I think, is kind of the dynamic characteristic that we have available to us now.
Yeah, sure. And I want to use this segue to say a lot about the current master planning process and how important that is. We're currently undergoing our next master planning process called City Modern. So if you want to check that out, go to midlandcitymodern.com. This is why master planning is so important and why we need the community to be a huge part of that, because that is how we are going to set the tone of what the next 25 years of built environment, for example, looks like, and being really intentional about what the future of our community looks like. Grant, I know I'm preaching to the choir on this one because this is what you live day in and day out, but that's why I want people to understand how important it is to be involved in that process. And that's how we create a community that looks the way that people envision it in the future.
Mm-hmm. It's very true. Very true.
It really is. And I think, a lot of things that we look at MDOT, if we have projects in the 5-year, but if you look at projects, 30, 40 years down the road, automobiles and the way we use our automobiles, even that's going to be changing. And that's, another consideration for the future. And so those master plans become critical in beginning to put a framework to what's coming up down the road, so to speak.
Absolutely. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit, John, based on some of the things that I heard over our lane reduction trial from Facebook. So some people would argue that if you want to slow cars down, you just reduce the speed limit. That's it. Wipe your hands. You've done all you can do. Now, all of us here know it's not quite that simple. Speed limit alone's rarely enough to get traffic calming results that you ultimately want if the road is over-engineered or if it's simply not safe for multimodal transportation. So what types of improvements are common for a type of project where you want to calm traffic in the CSS approach?
So inevitably, this is kind of where the brass tacks of it fall in. And in areas where you're looking to slow things down, it's a function of many different factors. The main thing, actually, believe it or not, is the efficiency of the roadway. So you could, for example, reduce your speed limit, but that may cause a backup further up the line. So when you look at things like that, then signal timing becomes important. Pedestrian and bike features become important. Along that corridor, are there bump outs, the lane width? Sometimes you can reduce those slightly to reduce speeds, believe it or not. The definition of space is also a manner in which have impacts on speed. For example, street trees, landscape plantings, ballards, pavement markings, overhead signals. Those are all components that affect that corridor and the way that people perceive that corridor. And as such, that influences, they all have a degree of influence on how they drive that space. And so there's several different things, but one thing you want to take away is efficiency. And that efficiency is moving traffic at a safe speed, but for multimodal, to provide a safe area and a safe feeling of well-being for that user.
Sure. Well, I think this is a great opportunity for us to stop for a quick break. So we will be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Word on the Streets. We're here with guest John Martin, M2D2 CS and CSS Coordinator with the Michigan Department of Transportation. We are talking all things context-sensitive solutions, context-sensitive design, and multimodal transportation. So far we've talked a lot about the CSS approach, what it is, how it's implemented by MDOT, and what they're looking for. So let's talk about some projects. What are some of the ways that CSS is being used around the state to improve safety and mobility by MDOT?
CSS and MDOT are, we strive to have that in all projects. A good example would be a city gateway or bridge project. An example of that be in Pittsfield Charter Township.
Okay.
In joint effort with MDOT was to redevelop that bridge. It's US 12 over US 23. And an aesthetic design effort was fostered between the community and MDOT. And also in the reconstruction and design of the bridge with a 15-foot pedestrian, what they call multi-use path now, but that is dedicated for non-motorized use. The planning for that project is both in real time and for the future to accommodate their evolving trail system. So a lot of times when it comes to CSS and input from communities, it's what we talked about as far as master planning. It's for the future as well. So sometimes when you see a project and it's finished and you look at it and go, wow, that's a sidewalk, but it's for something in the future, and it's economic use of those dollars. This process demonstrates the effort of the community and MDOT working together to provide an aesthetic feature in a bridge, that was going to be replaced while meeting both pedestrian and bike needs, which was not part of the original project. Additionally, in the city of Lansing, there was a road diet actually in there in 2014 on M43, which is Grand River.
Yep.
And that project, here again, reduced the lanes by one, and with zero impact on flow. But at the same time, it provided enhancements to the existing Riverwalk trail system and a safer passage for both pedestrians and bicyclists across M43. And it was that teamwork and that effort together that actually produces those solutions. And at MDOT, we work very closely with community and the engineers to be able to pull that through.
Yeah, that's super important to mention the community input. Is we've worked with MDOT pretty extensively throughout the lane reduction trial, and then now as we're getting ready to start this next phase of the process. And MDOT's been a great partner with us, and we do everything that we can to help give them the input that they need to make the right decisions for our community, which it's a two-way street. No pun intended. So.
Yes. Well, and that's a very good point, Katie, because listening to the community and listening for the desires of what not only stakeholders but also just the general public is looking for is something that's very important to us at the city. And I think one thing to point out is talking about non-motorized transportation and other things. It's not a new thing. It's not something that just kind of poof appeared in 2017 or 2018. It's actually quite a few decades that we've been hearing from the community in Midland that people want safer and more opportunities to ride their bike and walk and do other modes of transportation beyond just driving everywhere. And as a result of that, the city's made it a point to start making non-motorized transportation methods a priority in our community. And Buttles Street Corridor is just another example where we know improvements can be made. So I've been really interested to hear more about this 2019 process that MDOT utilizes called M2D2, which I know, John, you've mentioned and a couple of times. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, and I was slightly disappointed to learn that it was not actually a robot. I thought maybe it was.
It sounds like it is, yes.
It is not, in case you're listening, just FYI. But it's way cool anyway.
I can't tell you how many times when I speak that I some do say, the second part I kind of goof up.
Sure, I bet.
And you're correct in as far as the evolution of complete streets and M2D2 and complete streets being there a little bit earlier, and at the federal level, that was something handed down to the states of, hey, when we're spending this money, we want to make sure that we're getting everybody involved, and we're basically getting everything in the project that we could possibly get in the project. And so that would be the complete streets component to it. Context sensitive solutions component to it is, where you kind of dial it into that local municipality or community where you need to pull out those features of that. If you go back to 2010, regards to M2D2, there were two laws in Michigan that were passed for complete streets, Public Act 134 and 135, and there's been a couple of slight variations of those over the years. But basically, it provided the framework of complete streets as it's being applied in the state of Michigan. And M2D2, which the guide came out in 2019. M2D2 stands for Multimodal Development and Delivery, was a project to support a Complete Streets initiative within MDOT and throughout the state of Michigan. And the important thing here is that this guidebook is for everyone. It's not just, it's what we use at MDOT to develop our projects and help us through the process. But at the same time, this is what we encourage communities to use also as a guide for multimodal development and how it can be incorporated. I think you have a link, but at the same time, if you Google michigan.gov/M2D2, the guidebook should come right up. And you can just click on it and have a look. But it does take you through the exact process that we use when we're going through projects. And M2D2 is a cohesive guide that we use for project stakeholder engagement and design. But it also gives us best practices from around the country and across the state. So if you go in the latter part of the document, or the guidebook, I should say, it gives examples, and sometimes those examples are very helpful to kind of get either discussion off the ground or to give you ideas for what can be incorporated for your particular use. And the guide is just a great resource for communities and MDOT alike to aid in the plan and construction of transportation systems and complete streets for multi-modes. It's really what our focus is and what we're after when we take on projects such as this. And the implementation of M2D2 early and throughout the process is crucial for stakeholder identification and then engagement throughout the course of the project. So it's an extremely helpful guide, and it's well used.
Yeah, we will link, like you said, we're going to link to the M2D2 guidebook on the podcast website for the episode, which you can find at cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors. And I honestly think it's a pretty interesting read, not just because we're doing this podcast. It's very easy to follow. It's got a lot of great graphics that really kind of walk you through what that looks like throughout the process and kind of the different considerations. So if you have ever driven down a street and thought, what were they thinking? You will really like this guidebook because it actually does go into some detail. And for me, I found it very easy to read and interesting to look at. And if you really like pictures, there are some good graphics in there that you can follow too. So John, we've been talking about so much today, but why do you think that this approach is so important as we consider what road design is like now in the 21st century?
Well, as we discussed here earlier, there are clear indicators in an increase for multi-modes of transportation. It's the direction that we're moving. And the auto only focus is really not in keeping with either the socioeconomic or use requirements of the user today. And so that's a lot, the shift that we've talked about earlier. The very makeup of the automobile itself is in the process of redesign. And we're seeing that change before our eyes as well. This in turn will have additional impacts in the near future of how we use our transportation system. MDOT is dedicated to being front when developing systems to meet the needs of the community. And M2D2 is a guide that provides a format for both localities and MDOT to work as a team to get all the needs on the table to be as efficient as possible and to be able to lay the groundwork for the future. Because a lot of these projects, they're not just for when the last stripe is laid down. And the idea is that, down the road, oh my goodness, down the road, is that we're able to use those improvements to just continue our progress.
Lots of road and street puns on this podcast, and we unashamedly use them regularly.
It's true. Very easy to land on. Yeah. Well, I know that I'm glad to hear you say that, John. And I know in your last couple of answers, you've talked a lot about the state policies and state law, but also federal policies that have been passed down, and that M2D2 guidebook, and it's really a collection of that, and how that's being implemented in Michigan and local places in Michigan too.
Sure. Yeah.
And our listeners may remember that we've talked quite a bit on this podcast about different legislation and how that's important to the way that we do things, how sometimes that can lead to decisions that maybe are counter to some of the other things that communities are wanting to achieve. But in the same way, we've also talked about something as recent as the Complete Streets Act of 2021 that was introduced in the House of Representatives earlier this year. And I know we've talked about both the City of Midland as well as MDOT having their own complete streets policies, even that today we've mentioned on this episode. But John, from your perspective, I guess thinking more into the future, and I know we've talked about planning into the future, but do you see the complete street and CSS approach really having a massive impact on what communities look like in the future?
I don't see how it could not, especially the way that things are at this time as far as communication and transportation. As a community and an environment, the way we get from point A to point B is different. And in addition, the way that we communicate with one another has also changed. Think back. As a result of world circumstances, more than likely, if we were doing this interview 2 years ago, would be together in your studio, your new studio now.
Right.
However, those circumstances have created change, and adaptation to that way can and had to happen. CS and CSS and, of course, M2D2 are practices that recognize an evolving environment that is needed to get everyone involved. And building roads and bridges, rest areas, freeways for 30, 40, 50 years down the road, let alone maintenance, is not an easy business. There are so many dedicated engineers, architects, landscape architects, and planners, and countless other professionals that participate in the execution of this work. The ability for the community to be a part of this process is now greater than ever. Just think of the way that we're able communicate and to reach out to one another. CSS, CS, and MDOT are essential tools for all stakeholders to be able to join in and participate in the transportation solutions for tomorrow. And I think it's just been a very exciting time for us with all this change, and to be able to take advantage and to get everybody involved that has a stake in what it is that we do every day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point of how important it is to engage the community, because while you listed a wide variety of experts that are involved in, the planning and design of roadways, we don't expect our residents to be road design experts. We don't expect them to be planning and community development experts, but they are experts in their lives, how they use the road, where they go, who they're going to see, how they communicate. And so, we're really asking them when we're starting to guide ourselves for the future, and then looking at the future of the community, that's where we need their expertise, is to tell us, what's going to help you thrive both now and in the future as we continue to build our community. So I'm really glad that you brought that up too, because I feel like a lot of people feel they have to really understand this in order to get involved in the public engagement process, and you don't have to be an engineering expert. Just like when we have people on boards and commissions, like our planning commission, for example, you don't have to be a planner to be on there. You don't have to be a building expert. You just have to love the community and want to make it better and be an expert in what you know and how you live. So that's really important to remember.
Absolutely.
So John, this has been fascinating today.
It
has. I have to admit, I have learned so much more about modern road design than I anticipated. Still not an expert. I just want to make that clear. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today and give more context. There's another pun. On your work with MDOT today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you, John.
Well, thank you. On behalf of MDOT, we thank you for the opportunity to share more on context-sensitive solutions and MDOT and our commitment to the community as we develop projects. It's been a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed our time together. Thank you.
That's all for this installment, but we'll be back next month with another episode and more updates on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project. See you soon, and slow down. This has been Word on the Streets, a podcast created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. For more information on this podcast or to learn more about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project, visit cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors.